By the summer of 1940, almost every free nation in Europe had fallen. France, the great power, had crumbled in just 6 weeks. Belgium and Holland surrendered almost without a fight. Norway and Denmark were swallowed whole by the Nazi war machine. And now, standing at the edge of the English Channel, Adolf Hitler looked across the water at the last obstacle between him and total domination of Europe. A small island, an island that everyone, including many of its own people, believed would fall within weeks. But what happened next over the skies of that island would become one of the most extraordinary stories of human courage ever told. And it all came down to a handful of young men, most of them barely old enough to vote, who stood between civilization and darkness. Welcome to Noctel, where history comes alive through stories that deserve to be remembered. To understand why Britain found itself so utterly alone, you have to picture the Europe of that moment. The continent had been swept clean by the Wehrmacht in a matter of months. Hitler's blitzkrieg tactics had shattered every army that stood against him. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all its heavy equipment on the beaches of France. Britain still had its navy, the most powerful in the world, but navies cannot stop bombers. And it still had its air force, the Royal Air Force, but the numbers were terrifying. Germany had assembled roughly 2,700 combat aircraft for the assault on Britain. The RAF could muster just 750 modern fighters. Every calculation, every projection, every military analyst in the world pointed to the same conclusion. Britain was finished. Behind the scenes, something remarkable had been built. Something the Germans did not fully understand until it was too late. Years before the war, a quiet, methodical man named Hugh Dowding had been constructing a defensive system unlike anything the world had ever seen. Dowding was not the kind of leader who inspired with fiery speeches or dramatic gestures. His pilots called him stuffy because of his reserved, almost cold demeanor. But beneath that exterior was a mind of extraordinary clarity. Dowding understood that Britain could never match Germany in raw numbers, so he decided to fight with intelligence instead. He oversaw the construction of a chain of radar stations along the entire British coastline. These stations could detect German aircraft while they were still over France, giving the defenders precious minutes to scramble their fighters and position them exactly where they needed to be. He built an elaborate system of command and control, where information from radar and from 30,000 volunteer ground observers flowed into operations rooms. There, young women moved markers across enormous maps, tracking every incoming raid in real time. Commanders watched these maps and directed their pilots with surgical precision. The Germans could never figure out how the British always seemed to know exactly where they were coming from. When France was collapsing in May of 1940, Winston Churchill pressured Dowding to send more fighter squadrons across the Channel to help the French. It was a politically reasonable request. France was an ally, and abandoning her seemed unthinkable. But Dowding refused. He stood before Churchill and the War Cabinet and said plainly that if more fighters were sent to France, the Battle of Britain would be lost before it even began. France was already finished, he argued, and every aircraft sent there would be destroyed for nothing. It was a decision that could have ended his career. It might have been the most important decision of the entire war. France fell regardless, and Britain kept its fighter strength intact. The battle began in early July, with German raids probing the Channel convoys and coastal defenses. But the real storm arrived in August. Hermann Goering, the commander of the Luftwaffe, was a man of tremendous ego and equally tremendous overconfidence. A decorated fighter ace from the First World War, he had become bloated by luxury and dulled by morphine addiction. He wore extravagant uniforms dripping with medals and lived in a palace filled with stolen art. He believed his air force was invincible, and he promised Hitler that the RAF would be destroyed in a matter of days. On the 13th of August, the day Goring grandly named Eagle Day, the full aerial assault was supposed to begin. But the British weather, unpredictable as always, refused to cooperate. Fog and low clouds disrupted the German plans. Some units launched without receiving the order to stand down, sending hundreds of bombers toward England without fighter escort. The radar-guided British fighters were waiting. The result was devastating for the Germans. Eagle Day ended in confusion and heavy losses, with little to show for it. 2 days later, on August 15th, the Germans tried again with everything they had. This time the weather was clear, and Göring threw his full strength into the attack, launching raids from Norway, Denmark, and France simultaneously. The assault from the north was meant to catch the British off guard, based on the assumption that all fighters had been pulled south. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. British radar detected the northern force while it was still far out over the North Sea. Fighters from 13 Group rose to meet them, and without escort, since the German fighters lacked the range to reach northern England, the bombers were slaughtered. The Luftwaffe's 5th Air Fleet lost so heavily that day that it never participated in the Battle of Britain again. German pilots would later call that day Black Thursday. The aircraft that fought this battle were machines of extraordinary character. The Supermarine Spitfire was a thing of beauty, elegant and fast, with elliptical wings that seemed almost sculptural. Pilots spoke of it with genuine love. One famously said that you did not fly a Spitfire, you wore it. Its responsiveness was immediate. Its ability to turn inside the German fighters gave British pilots a crucial edge in dogfights. But the Spitfire was expensive and difficult to build, so there were fewer of them. The workhorse of the battle was the Hawker Hurricane, a sturdier, more rugged machine that absorbed tremendous punishment and kept flying. It was easier to repair, easier to fly, and it shot down more German aircraft than the Spitfire simply because there were more of them in service. The British tactic was elegant in its simplicity. The faster Spitfires would engage the German fighter escorts, tying them up in swirling dogfights, while the Hurricanes dove into the bomber formations, tearing them apart with concentrated bursts of gunfire. Each aircraft carried 8 machine guns that could unleash an extraordinary volume of fire, but ammunition lasted only 15 seconds of continuous shooting. Pilots had to get close, sometimes within 100 meters, before pressing the firing button. One pilot recalled getting so near to a German bomber that he could count the rivets on its wings. The young men who flew these machines were extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. Most were in their early 20s. Some were teenagers. They came from cities and farms, from wealthy families and working-class homes. A quarter of them were not even British. Poles who had escaped the destruction of their country, Czechs, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Free French, even a handful of Americans who had crossed the Atlantic to fight before their country entered the war. They were united by something beyond nationality, a determination to stand against tyranny regardless of the cost. The cost was staggering. New pilots arrived at their squadrons with as little as 10 hours of experience on the fighters they would take into combat. 10 hours, and then they were thrown against German veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The survival rate for newcomers was appalling. Many were killed on their first or second mission. They had not yet learned the basic rules that kept experienced pilots alive. Never fly straight for more than 30 seconds. Always check behind you, above you, below you. Beware the sun, because that is where the enemy hides before diving to kill. The veterans tried to teach the newcomers, but in the chaos of battle, there was rarely time. Life on the ground between sorties was a strange mixture of boredom and terror. Pilots slept in their flying gear, boots on, ready to sprint to their aircraft the moment the scramble bell rang. Between flights, they tried to rest, playing cards, reading, sleeping on the grass beside their planes. But the tension was always there, coiled in their stomachs, waiting for the bell. They flew 4, 5, sometimes 6 or 7 sorties a day. The exhaustion was crushing. One pilot described falling asleep standing up, sleeping in his cockpit while mechanics refueled his aircraft, sleeping through a bomb that landed 50 meters from his window. Friendships formed fast and ended faster. Pilots learned not to grow close to the new arrivals because most of them would be gone within days. One veteran recalled seeing new faces appear and then simply vanish 2 or 3 days later without ever learning their names. By late August, Göring shifted his strategy to systematically destroying the RAF's airfields and command infrastructure. This was the most dangerous phase of the battle. Day after day, waves of bombers pounded the fighter bases in southeast England. Runways were cratered, buildings destroyed, aircraft burned on the ground. The squadrons of 11 Group, commanded by the brilliant Keith Park, were under relentless pressure. Park managed his dwindling resources with remarkable skill, sending small formations to intercept each raid, trying to break up the German formations before they could reach their targets. But the strain was telling. In the last week of August and the first week of September, the British lost nearly 200 pilots killed or seriously wounded. Dowding sent a grim report warning that the situation was becoming critical. The system was bending toward the breaking point, and then Hitler made the mistake that saved Britain. On the night of August 24th, a small group of German bombers, assigned to hit oil installations along the Thames, lost their way in the darkness and accidentally dropped their bombs on London. It was an unauthorized act, a violation of Hitler's own orders, but the damage was done. British civilians died in their homes. Churchill, furious, ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin the following night. The physical damage to Berlin was minimal, but the symbolic impact was enormous. Goering had personally promised Hitler that Berlin would never be bombed. Now British bombs had fallen on the German capital. Hitler was enraged. In a thundering speech, he announced that Germany would retaliate with overwhelming force. The bombing of London would begin immediately. From a military standpoint, this was a gift to the RAF. The battered airfields could now be repaired. Exhausted pilots could finally get a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. The command system could rebuild itself. The German bombers were now flying deeper into England, which meant their fighter escorts were operating at the very edge of their fuel range. Over London, the German fighters could stay for barely 25 minutes before they had to turn back or risk ditching in the Channel. On September 7th, 1,000 German aircraft assembled over the French coast and headed for London. Goering himself stood on a cliff overlooking the Channel, drinking champagne as his armada passed overhead. The formation stretched for miles, darkening the sky. When the bombs began falling on London's East End, the docks along the Thames erupted into an inferno visible for 100 miles. The city burned through the night. 350 people died in that first attack. 1,500 were wounded, but London did not break. The next morning, people emerged from shelters and underground stations, surveyed the devastation, and went to work. They walked or cycled through rubble-strewn streets, past shattered buildings and smoldering ruins, and they carried on. The Blitz had begun, and the British people met it with a defiance that stunned the world. The decisive day came on September 15th. Goering, still believing the RAF was down to its last 100 fighters, ordered one final massive assault to finish the job. Churchill chose that day to visit Park's command center at Uxbridge, descending into the underground operations room to watch the battle unfold in real time. Slowly, markers began appearing on the great map table. Dozens of them, then hundreds. An enormous German force was assembling over France. Every available squadron was scrambled. 21 squadrons rose to defend London. When the first German formation crossed the coast, 5 British squadrons hit it simultaneously, Spitfires diving from above, Hurricanes attacking from the flanks. The sky became a maelstrom of wheeling, diving, firing aircraft. The German pilots were shocked. Where had all these British fighters come from? They were supposed to be nearly finished. But here they were everywhere, attacking with ferocious determination. A second wave of German bombers met the same reception. The big wing from 12 Group, 5 squadrons flying together, crashed into the formation like a hammer. Bombers began jettisoning their loads and turning for home. Some never even reached London before dumping their bombs and fleeing. In the operations room, Churchill turned to Park and asked what reserves they had left. Park answered quietly that there were none. Every single fighter was in the air. It was the moment on which everything hung. But the next German wave never came. The Luftwaffe was spent. By the end of the day, the Germans had lost 60 aircraft. The British had lost 26. More important than the numbers was the psychological impact. The Germans finally understood that they could not win. 2 days later, Hitler quietly postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. The dream of a Nazi-dominated Europe had been broken over the skies of southern England. The Battle of Britain was over. The Luftwaffe had lost more than 900 aircraft and 3,000 of its finest airmen. The British had lost 544 pilots, 1 in every 5 who fought. It was a terrible price, but it was not paid in vain. Winston Churchill, in words that have echoed through the decades, said simply, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Years later, one of those few, a surviving pilot, reflected on what they had done. He said he felt immense pride at having been part of what happened in 1940, but also felt like something of a fraud because so many remarkable people had died, people who were the true heroes, and the recognition and honors really belonged to them. The Battle of Britain proved that the Nazis could be defeated. It gave hope to every occupied nation in Europe. It showed America that Britain was worth supporting. It was the turning point that made everything else possible, the survival of freedom itself, defended by a small band of young men who refused to let the darkness win. If stories like this move you, stay with us here on Noctel. There are countless moments in history where everything hung in the balance, and we are here to tell those stories the way they deserve to be told.